When you sign in using an administrative account, User Account Control or UAC limits that account's access to that of a standard user. This helps protect the computer. In earlier versions of Windows and with earlier apps running on earlier versions of Windows, when you signed in as an administrator, you had full access to everything. This allowed malicious persons with malicious software to exploit security weaknesses. By using User Account Control, even an administrative account operates as a standard account unless you try to perform a task that requires activation. Then you're prompted. UAC only elevates the account's privileges to an administrative level when it's required, and only after prompting you to do that. The type of prompt you see will vary depending upon how you signed in and who you signed in as. Standard users can perform the following tasks without requiring elevation: change their own password, configure accessibility, configure power options, install updates using Windows Update, install device drivers via Windows Update, view Windows 10 settings, pair Bluetooth devices, and establish network connections, reset network adapters, and perform basic network diagnostics and repair. The following tasks require elevation. This is not an exhaustive list, it's an indicative list. Install or remove apps. Install a device driver that's not included in Windows or in Windows Update. Modify the UAC settings. Open Windows Firewall and Control Panel. Add or remove user accounts. Restore system backups. And configure Windows Update settings. When you perform a task that requires elevation, UAC can prompt the user in a number of different ways. First is prompt for consent. So you see a yes/no type of prompt. The other way is to prompt for credentials, where you have to provide a username and a password that has the appropriate abilities. You can configure the following UAC options. Access this through Control Panel. Never notify me. Notify me only when apps try to make changes to my computer, but don't dim the desktop. Notify me only when apps try to make changes to my computer, and thereby dim the desktop. And always notify me. The default is shown over here. Notify me when apps try to make changes to my computer. Don't notify me when I make changes to Windows settings. Let's take a look at how to configure the UAC settings and how to test UAC. Okay, so user account control can be managed in a number of different ways. One is to manage it locally on a computer by computer basis. If I run user account here, I can bring up change user account control settings. And you can see that the default value is notify me only when apps try to make changes to my computer, default. Don't notify me when I make changes to Windows settings. So that's recommended if you're working with fairly standard websites with which you're familiar and you're not installing a large number of downloaded apps or even any downloaded apps. I can change that very easily by scrolling up here and say, pretty much if I do anything, notify me. And down here say only notify me when apps try to make changes to my computer, but don't dim my desktop. In other words, let me carry on working. Or I can just turn it off completely. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. Since this was introduced in earlier version of Windows, Windows Vista, it's become more streamlined. So we saw some changes in Windows 7 to make it less intrusive. In Windows 10, it operates very much in the background unless it needs to tell you something. And I would recommend leaving it at the default setting of notify me only when apps try to make changes to my computer, default. So I'll click cancel here. The other way to make changes is more fine-grained changes is to use the group policy editor. Now you can do this on the local computer or you can do it through group policy as we saw in the last lesson. So I'm going to open up the local group policy editor and I have navigated to computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, security options. And I've now changed the list here to be the opposite way, alphabetically in reverse, so I can find the user account control settings, which all have a user account control prefix. So let's take a look. Switch to the secure desktop when prompting for elevation. double click that setting, and you can see that that's been enabled. So in other words, the desktop is dimmed and you can't do anything until elevation has been confirmed. So it's a way of locking down the computer until you've confirmed an action. That's inherently more secure than allowing work to continue. Run all administrators in admin approval mode. If you turn that off, if you disable that, effectively you're turning off user account control. Behavior of the elevation prompt for standard users. By default, a standard user, that's to say a regular user account, will be prompted for credentials. So they'll need to specify a username and a password to be able to confirm that they want to perform the elevated task. You can choose between automatically deny elevation requests or prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. So there are only secure options here. You can either instantly deny the request to elevate, or you can force them in one of two ways to provide credentials. And that's necessary because they're not signed in with an administrative account. The behavior of the elevation prompt for administrators in admin approval mode is more interesting. By default, it prompts for consent for non-Windows binaries. In other words, if you try to run a program that's not being created by Microsoft, then you'll be prompted for consent. That just means a yes or no. But we can change that behavior to say elevate automatically without prompting. That's not very secure. Well, it's anything but secure, really. Prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. That's very secure. So that's actually going to ask you to confirm your username and password, and it's going to lock the desktop until you've done so. So although you're signed in as an administrator, you have to sign in again, in essence, to be able to confirm what it is that you're trying to do. Very secure, but could be quite annoying. Prompt for consent on the secure desktop means that anytime you try to do anything that requires elevation, you have to confirm you want to do it, even if the thing you're trying to do is an internal Windows thing or is related to a Microsoft provided piece of software. Prompt for credentials not on the secure desktop, prompt for consent not on the secure desktop, and prompt for consent for non-Windows binary. So you can see, with the exception of elevate without prompting, which is the least secure, the rest are in descending secure order. So the default prompt for consent for non-Windows binaries just means when you try to do something, it will prompt that you want to do that thing. So a very simple demonstration of the difference is as follows. If I right-click Start and choose Windows PowerShell Admin, I'm asking for an elevated Windows PowerShell command line. And the default behavior is to prompt you to confirm that you want to do this. Prompts for consent. So that's fine. Now let's change this, because I'm signed in as an admin. I'm going to say, let's see, prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. So again, I'll ask for a Windows PowerShell admin command window. And this time, as you can see, we've got a different prompt. We're being prompted for credentials. So it's saying I'm signed in as this particular user, Andrew, who's the local admin user. I now need to provide the password for that user to continue. And then say, yes, I want to do that. So obviously, manually configuring things is quite time consuming on a per computer basis. But using the local group policy editor allows you to exert more fine-grained control, but still is a bit of a tortuous process. So you'd be recommended to configure the exact same option, but through group policy, using a domain controller and using the group policy management editor on the domain controller. And that would allow you to configure user account control across your organization. In the demonstration, you saw how to configure user account control and how to test it.